Just after sunset, on a warm summer evening, 4-year-old Heidi Jones is about to drift off to sleep when her 23-year-old single mother, Loretta, cracks open Heidi's bedroom door.
That night, my mom came to my bedroom and she told me, "Don't come out." And I believe that if I heard any sound or anything that night, I did what my mom told me to do, and I didn't go out. In the morning, I looked out of my keyhole before going into my front room. When I opened the door, I saw something lying on the floor. My next vivid memory is I am out on the front porch, and my next door neighbor is out there digging for worms. He says, "Heidi, come here, I have to show you something." And I says, "I can't. I think my mommy's dead."
When police arrived, they saw Loretta half-clothed, laying on the floor, deceased.
There was blood on the couch, there was blood on the floor, there was blood everywhere.
Loretta had been sexually assaulted, and she was stabbed twice in the chest and 17 times in her back, and her throat was attempted to be cut.
The investigation didn't reveal any forced entry, any real signs of tremendous struggle. There wasn't tipped over furniture, there wasn't broken windows, the door jamb wasn't broken.
The police at the time did take quite a bit of forensic info, fingerprints, blood samples, carpet fibers, and some couch fibers as well.
Investigators wait to interview Heidi until her family arrives.
The sheriff kept calling my mother, trying to locate my father. And finally, my dad comes home and he's very upset and, looks kind of white and in shock. And my mother asked him, "What is wrong?" It was just such a shock because I felt like nothing bad would ever happen to my family. There was 6 of us total, 6 children. They ranged to my oldest sister is 9 years older than me, and then Loretta was 7 years older than me. I had a really good relationship with Loretta. We shared a bedroom for, clear through my elementary years. We'd go to bed at night and she'd have us look underneath the covers. And she'd say, "Do you see them? There's Fauna, Flora, and Merriweather, the little fairies from Sleeping Beauty." Her imagination was so awesome that she got me to believe that I could actually see them. When we grew up, I listened to music with Loretta all the time, the 60s music. Bobby V, Bobby Rydell, The Ventures, Elvis. And I do remember dragging Main Street a few times with Loretta before I got my driver's license. And then going to the little tasty freezes and just see if there's any new guys. When we found out that Loretta was pregnant, I remember my dad not really being upset that she was really pregnant, but upset with a father. But Loretta did want to keep her baby. There was no question about that. She was just happy that she was going to have this little baby, and she was just a happy mom when Heidi was born. Loretta did work for my dad, and she was taking accounting classes. She was really working hard on making her life better for her and Heidi. And Loretta was so awesome as a mom. She always had to make sure her little girl was taken care of.
I remember we would go out and we would get ice cream. She made a ton of my own clothes. She made me dolls. She was a wonderful mom to me.
The first thing that my mother said is, "Where is Heidi?" And we found out she was at the next door neighbor's house. So we went to go get Heidi.
With her grandparents now at her side, detectives ask Heidi what she saw and heard the night before.
I know that I have something trapped in my brain of something that happened that night. I believe it was too traumatic for me to remember. I don't believe my mom screamed or cried that night. If I had heard my mom scream in the next room, I probably would have came out of the room to see what was going on. So I believe my mom was my hero that night by protecting me.
The 4-year-old's memory is murky, except for one very important detail.
I remember telling my grandma what I could possibly remember. I said, Tom did it. Tom killed my mom.
During the investigation, Heidi's grandma was jotting down everything Heidi was saying at that time. And there was an entry on this notepad on the morning that the body was discovered. Heidi told her grandmother it was Tom that killed my mom. They had a first name.
Just Tom. No last name, no description. That's all little Heidi can remember about the man who killed her mother.
I still have so much hidden inside my head that doesn't want to come out. But I know that I knew Tom. Tom was a person that came around my mom, our house, quite a bit, because as a 4-year-old, I knew his name.
As friends and family search their minds for a Tom, detectives got a new lead about the night of Loretta's murder.
July 30th, 1970. I lived about 3 blocks away from Loretta. At the time, I was 10 years old. My brother and his friend were outside playing ball. I was out riding my bike around the house, and I come around the corner and noticed that my brother had gone in the house and it was starting to get dark. So I figured I'd better go in as well. As I was walking is when I noticed this man coming at me. He grabbed me and held me up against the side of the house, and he had my hands behind my back. He was stepping on my feet and another hand over my mouth. I was trying to scream and I couldn't get the scream out. It just wouldn't come out. I was terrified. I couldn't get away from him. Eventually his hand kind of got loose and I was able to scream really loud.
Her brother, her stepdad, and her brother's friend ran outside to see what was going on, and they saw this suspect running. He ran south. Well, south, 3 blocks later, is Loretta Jones's house. The odds of an attempted abduction and a homicide that happened within an hour of each other, 3 blocks away from each other, is far more than a coincidence. I would immediately assume that this was the same guy that killed Loretta. So the police at the time are combing the area looking for a murder suspect, been doing field investigation on pretty much anybody that's walking near the house or even miles away. They found an individual that was hitchhiking from Price to the town of Provo. This gentleman was carrying a pocket knife with what they thought was blood on it. They had taken him back to Price.
At that point in time, my mom and I had to get in the cop car and they drove us to identify the guy. And when I looked at him and saw him, I knew right away it wasn't him.
The hitchhiker is off the hook for the attack on Lori, and the knife he was carrying can't be linked to Loretta's murder.
They eventually released the suspect they found in Provo. His alibi checked out. He was nowhere in that area at that time.
A lot of the town was just scared that here's this guy that killed my sister, and he had grabbed a little girl that night as well. Everybody's wondering, where's this guy? What happened to him?
On August 1st, a tip is called into the sheriff's office. The caller suggests deputies look into a local railroad worker named Tom Egley.
I knew that Loretta had dated Tom Egley one time on a blind date. I thought she didn't like him and she didn't want anything to do with this guy. But Heidi was always right to the same story every time. You know, Tom killed my mom. He just seemed like he was a perfect suspect.
At the time of this murder, Tom was living in a motel in Helper, Utah.
He was living with his girlfriend, who was 8 months pregnant.
Detectives pick up Tom and take him to the sheriff's office for questioning.
Tom Egley explained to the police on the night of the homicide, he hitched a ride with a couple of younger teens. He'd been dropped off in Price at a little local fast food joint. He said he grabbed a burger and sat down on the curb and ate it. And then his story is that he was in Price just walking around window shopping, but he was nowhere near Loretta Jones's house.
Egley insists that while in Price, he did not attack Lori or even visit Loretta.
Tom says he wound up at a bar called the Highway Rendezvous on Springland Road, probably 11:30 at night.
Investigators set out to corroborate Egley's story.
At the Highway Rendezvous, the owner of the bar, she said that Tom did come in that night, kind of skittish, nervous. Tom had red speckles on his shirt, and he said he had been painting. Red paint must have got on him. The cops met up with Tom at his apartment, and he allowed them in to let them search his room. They did take a pair of Levi's that Tom said he was wearing that night and a shirt.
Detectives bag the clothing and collect hair, blood, and fingerprint samples from Egley. It's all sent to the FBI crime lab in Washington, D.C.
I remember my mom's funeral. She had on a blue dress, and it had a super high collar, so that you couldn't see where her neck had been slit. I remember looking in the casket, and I thought she looked like Sleeping Beauty.
It was really hard to see Loretta, and there's her daughter, Heidi, just crying, realizing that her mother is gone now. I was pretty angry.
1 month after Loretta's murder, investigators receive the FBI lab results.
So the fibers that they discovered on Tom's clothing did match the fibers that were found to be similar to those on Loretta Jones's rug. Investigators feel that they had enough probable cause to arrest Tom, and that is what they did.
Detectives believe that Tom Egley was being chased through the neighborhood for trying to kidnap an 11-year-old child. And they believe he recognized Loretta's home, and he went in.
They had arrested a man. My brother and I went up to the jail and was asked to try to identify him.
Jim Kulo believes that he was looking at the right person, but Lori could not positively ID Tom as the person who grabbed her. The evidence was pretty weak, all circumstantial.
After Tom Egley pleads not guilty to Loretta Jones' murder, prosecutors present their evidence at a pretrial hearing.
During this preliminary hearing, prosecutors did bring up the witnesses for Tom being in town that day, seeing him at the bar. The prosecutors said the fiber evidence that the FBI produced out of their lab was similar in nature to the rug that Loretta had in her home. But Tom was known to have been in her home before.
The case is thin. There's almost no physical evidence and no reliable witnesses.
The judge ruled there was not enough evidence to bind him over to trial. So Tom Egley was released.
Tom Egley just happened to be a guy at the wrong place at the wrong time walking around.
Unsure if they ever had the right suspect, detectives start over from scratch.
Carbon County Sheriff Albert Pasick and Price City Police Chief Art Poloni, they would come to our house regularly to interview me about what I knew that night, if there was anything else that I could possibly remember.
But there's nothing else that 4-year-old Heidi can offer.
I think a lot of people were confused of what really happened, as we were. Where's this guy that killed Loretta?
One year after her mother's murder, by the time Heidi turns 5, the case goes as cold as Utah's winter winds.
My parents ended up adopting Heidi after Loretta got killed. With my dad, he was really hurting inside. I think this really took a toll on him. That's why maybe he passed away 4 years later at a pretty young age.
Once my grandpa died, it was pretty much my grandma and me and my uncle that lived at home. And, you know, life was happening, school was happening. And anytime I tried to talk to my grandma about my mom, it would just make her cry.
My mom was to the point where she just wanted Loretta to rest in peace.
It was just kind of accepted, for lack of a better word, that my mom's murder wasn't going to be solved.
We were all just trying to find something that was normal, you know, just to heal and move on with our lives as individuals.
I moved to California in 1986. Life was good. It was very freeing being able to tell people what you wanted them to know about you.
Now an adult, Heidi refuses to let her mother's case be forgotten.
In 1989, I started this whole letter writing campaign. I wrote to Price City Police Chief. I wrote to Carbon County Sheriff's Office. I wrote to the FBI. But it seemed like the more that I pressed for information on my mom's case, I started hitting brick wall after brick wall. I was getting nowhere. So I took all my notes and letters away into a binder, and hopefully I'll pull it out again later in life. I was struggling hard in California. I know that my mom would have gone to great lengths to do whatever she needed to do for me, and she proved that the night she was murdered. How could I just let that go? My mom was my hero that night. I owed it to her. I owed it to her to do something about this. I approached my grandma and I says, I'm gonna see if I can't solve my mom's murder case. she said, "Why don't you just let it go?" And I says, "Because I can't let it go. If I didn't do it, nobody else was going to do it."
I really honestly had mixed feelings. Was kind of feeling a little bit like my mom. Maybe after all these years, we need to let Loretta rest in peace. But the other part of me was like, it's time for us to find out who really killed her.
I moved back to Utah, and I actually met with the Price City police chief. And he felt that they had done everything they possibly could except for interviewing the original suspect. I was feeling pretty devastated again. I was getting nowhere. 4th of July weekend, 2009, my car was stolen. I had jumped on Facebook and put, "My car is stolen. Can you believe that?" And David responded, "Oh, too bad I'm not closer. I could help." I met David Brewer when I was in high school. He's a year older than I am. He says, "I work for Carbon County Sheriff's Office in Price, Utah." The case back in 1970 belonged to the Carbon County Sheriff's Office. And immediately I got the ding, ding, ding. I need to go talk to David Brewer. I called David Brewer and I told him this story about my mom being murdered.
It wasn't until I met her in person and she handed me photographs that the details started really kicking in.
These were not law enforcement photographs. They were family photographs.
I says, "Well, I'll just go down and get the case file, go grab all the evidence and start going through it and get this thing going." But it was quickly discovered that there was no case file and there was no box of evidence. They were thrown away or missing. The old jail used to be the evidence room. They had a cell for the evidence room. I honestly think that when they moved the new jail from the old, I think someone probably looked at that case and just says, "This will never be solved," and they tossed it. I mean, it's sad to say, but I think that's how it was. You know, it's hard to tell why this case went cold in the first place. Without having the case file, I can't really say why it went dormant. But then once the evidence was lost and the case files were lost, it was bound to just stay that way permanently. Being the rookie homicide investigator, cold case guy, it is very disheartening when you don't have anything to go off of. You don't have a case file.
While searching the state medical examiner's office, Detective Brewer finally locates a document from the original case.
They did have a very good detailed medical examiner's report. It was discovered that a vaginal swab had been done and there was semen present on it. And with today's standards, of course, in DNA, I thought I could have this guy in 10 minutes if I just had that swab. But it was gone with everything else. I had my peers and some of my superiors tell me that it was time to just let it go. Even my partner told me, "You've done all you can." But no, I never let it go. Besides, Heidi wouldn't allow me to quit. Shortly after, I ran a newspaper article for more information in this case because I was hoping the public could be my case file. So I get a call from this gal who said that she had info for me on my case. She said, "Have I ever seen that Loretta wrote the killer's name in blood?" And I says, "How would you know this anyway? I mean, you weren't allowed in the crime scene." And she says, "Yeah, I was." She says, "I was living with Heidi's grandmother at the time, going to school. And the day after this happened, Heidi's grandfather asked her and one of Heidi's aunts to go to the house."
The police let us go into the home long enough to get clothes and a few things for Heidi.
So they went into the living room and she says, "I saw it right there with my own eyes." Didn't write the whole name, she only got the T and the O out. We pulled the photo up, blew it up, and there it was. definite T and an O written in blood.
Wow. That is heavy duty stuff. I get goosebumps right now thinking about that.
Loretta was trying to tell the story herself and help us out. And it looks like the last thing she did on this earth was write the letter O, and she couldn't get the M in there for Tom. In the beginning, and to be fair, I excluded the knowledge of an individual named Tom Egley. I could have only assumed that they didn't have enough evidence to bind it over for trial because they had the wrong guy.
But at the end of the day, Tom Egley was the only person we could not eliminate as a suspect. And at that time, he became the focus as he was in 1970.
Detective Brewer speaks with every living witness who testified in Egley's 1970 hearing, and one witness who did not, Marcia Hidalgo, Egley's then-girlfriend.
We drove 14 hours to get to Kansas and met up with her. I asked her, I said, do you know anything about that homicide he was arrested for back then?
All I was ever told, this girl that he had been going with before I got there had been stabbed 14 times.
What do you remember about that night?
You know, I was pregnant. I waited up for him, he didn't come. It was late.
Tom Egley came home about maybe 3 in the morning.
I was kind of ticked, you know. Where were you at? He's like, oh, I'm here now. And then he went in and he took a bath in his clothes.
He bathed in his clothes.
He bathed in his clothes.
And then after he took a bath in his clothes, he put them in a bag, and then the next day took him down to the laundromat where this burn barrel existed and threw him in there and burned him. My jaw dropped. I did ask her if she told the cops then what she's telling me now, and she says she did. I have my doubts on that. Back then, she's 8 months pregnant with his child. So I think the protection end kicked in with Marcia. It was time to take my knowledge of things that people had told me and take it right to Tom himself.
Okay, 11:35 a.m. Approaching the residence of Thomas Edward Egley for interview.
I tracked Tom Egley down in a town called Rocky Ford, Colorado, and me and Detective Taylor went to go visit him. Tom is in his front yard doing some yard work.
I want to know if we could take some of your time this morning, talk to you about some issues back in Carbon County a few years back.
Carbon County.
So we went into his house. He was a collector of many things, a classic hoarder.
Well, yeah, any idea why you think we might be here to talk to you?
Well, years ago, one of my ex-girlfriends was killed. They arrested me for it, but they turned me loose.
I asked him to tell me, I said, what do you remember that night?
I stopped at a drive-in or something there and got me a hamburger. I know I sat down on the curb and ate it. There was nothing going on, so I headed back. Marcia was at the hotel with the baby, so she knew I was gone.
Loretta's daughter, frankly, named you back then.
Well, yeah, she knew my name. I'd been there.
We kept talking. Tom, what do you think should happen to a guy 40 years after he kills a person?
Do you think that person would deserve to go to jail now?
Depends on whether he's done it again or not, you know.
Obviously he did this and didn't do it again. Is this what he's trying to tell me?
Something comes up, be sure to call.
I knew beyond any reasonable doubt that this was the guy. and wanted to pitch it to our county attorney, which I did. His opinion was there was just not enough. We wouldn't never be able to get it past their desk, let alone into a court hearing. So this thing got colder than it's ever got. When you work so hard on something, it's hard to swallow that pill.
In 2016, Detective Brewer presents Loretta's case at a regional cold case seminar.
One thing that came about was, have you ever thought about exhuming the body? And so a gal from a private crime lab stood up and says, they've retrieved DNA off people after 50 plus years in the grave. When I got back from that cold case conference, first thing I did is called Heidi. I says, thinking about exhuming your mother's body, what do you think?
I told him, give me a shovel, I'll help dig.
The two main reasons it was decided to exhume Loretta's body was, one, there was a chance we may recover DNA based on the autopsy records, and secondly, we were confident it would generate media attention. Both would be valuable.
So as they were pulling the body out of the ground, water started pouring out of the vault. And the crime scene investigator looked at it and says, no, we're not going to find any DNA here.
Next, detectives try a bluff.
I called the Rocky Ford Gazette, told them got a local suspect out there and that we've discovered DNA on the body. The whole idea is to make Tom think we had DNA and see how he reacts. The day after we reinterned Loretta, I received a phone call from Rocky Ford from a gal named Lisa Carter.
I knew Tom Egley well. He was my neighbor, and he was a friend of my dad's.
She had told me that I have the right guy. Tom Egley is the one that murdered Loretta Jones. I says, well, what makes you think that? She says, well, I have property bordering his, and one day Tom came over to the house in the backyard, and he was going to cut down my tree with a chainsaw because some of the branches, I guess, were hanging over to his property or whatnot.
I was mad. So I went out to the driveway. I tapped him on the shoulder, and he came up with that chainsaw, and he swung like a baseball bat.
I says, all that makes you think that, Tom killed Loretta Jones?
Tom had a look in his eyes. His eyes become a white crystal color, and you can't even see the soul. There's nothing there. He would have cut me in half in a heartbeat, not thought twice. That's why when somebody said that he might have a propensity for violence, I believed it.
She says, hey, if you need my help with anything, let me know.
It was like a gift from God. And I kind of ran it by our prosecutors, what do you think of using an undercover? They said, just don't come back without a confession. Lisa Carter knew Tom personally, so she had almost a daily contact with him. And wow, then I started thinking we can use an undercover agent here.
So, a total stranger's gonna step in, wear a wire, and help us? Lisa Carter is an incredible human being.
We'd learned her husband was a Rocky Ford police officer, and Tom was aware her husband was out of town for several days for training. And so we adopted the plan.
Can I smoke in here, Tom?
Sure.
I went to Tom with the idea that I was going to betray my husband.
I'm sick. If I was here, I'm done.
So I explained to Tom Egley that my husband had been in training in Utah, and I let him know that during that training that Tom was the topic of the class and that he was known as a suspect in the murder of Loretta Jones.
I said, I've known Tom 20 plus years. Said, Tom's kind of in a bad spot. And I said, what do they have? said that they still had the swabs from the night of the killing that the people from the autopsy took.
Well, I don't know how they could have DNA.
I told Tom that I felt like it was important to protect him. And the big part was, you're my dad's friend. Even though Dad is deceased, he would want me to help you.
Everybody makes a mistake in their life. You know, everybody snaps. Everybody has a moment when they're just fried and happens.
During the conversations, I never feared for my safety. I was careful. I never turned my back, and I watched anytime his hands went near his pockets.
Lisa spends 2 more days gaining Egley's trust. And then she strikes gold.
And how far did Loretta live from the sandwich place?
Not very far, I don't think.
Tom said that on the night that Loretta Jones was murdered, he had gone into town to get a hamburger. He never did admit to trying to abduct the child. He said he just was in the neighborhood and he knocked on the door. He said that Loretta Jones let him in.
Okay. And the door closed, and then what? What would you think happened? If you had to guess, what would you think happened?
I was turned down for sex.
Okay. And that made you feel how?
Like
He said that she walked into her kitchen, and it's my understanding that Heidi Jones's bedroom was off of the kitchen. I believe in my heart that Loretta knew that she was gonna die or there was gonna be something really bad happening. And I believe she shut that door.
And when she come back, I stabbed her.
It totally blew me away. He never changed his voice, and I think that's what got me. It was just like as if I was telling you about Sunday dinner. He acknowledged that she wasn't dead, that she was moaning. And I said, well, did you have sex with her? And he said, yeah, of course I had sex with her. He said it was consensual. And I said, Tom, you stabbed her. How is that consensual? And he said, she didn't tell me no. And it took me a while before I was able to process what I just heard. I don't believe there's any remorse to Tom at all. I don't believe he even cares. But I pulled myself back together.
So you remember having sex with her, and then what?
I lost it. I cut her throat, and I left.
That just blew me away. I could not react. I didn't know what to say.
I know a good admission when you hear one, and I had it. I had a lawfully obtained admission to murder.
And it was game on from then.
I convinced Tom that the family wanted closure. And I said, let's call the detective and let's see if we can sit down with him and talk to him.
Egley agrees to speak with Brewer on one condition. Police can't arrest him at the meeting. Detective Brewer agrees.
And I'd be lying if I didn't say I wasn't nervous, but we got there. Tom invited us back in the house.
It's been 46 years, so I'm scared every time somebody shows up at my door.
It's a hard thing to look over your shoulder that long.
Yeah.
It is. It really is. And then right out of the blue, he just started talking.
We had sex. There was no rape involved.
Okay.
I lost it because I'd been drinking.
Do you remember cutting her throat?
Yeah, but I don't remember ever stabbing her.
Okay.
Before I left Tom's house, we had asked Tom one more question.
If you could tell Loretta's daughter anything in the world right now, what would you tell her?
I had just came out of the store, and Brewer called and he says, hey, are you busy? And he's like, Tom said to tell you that he's sorry he killed your mom. And I'm like, oh my God, are you serious? Are you freaking kidding me? Are you serious?
She was the only person that I wanted to call, and that was a very, very good moment.
After Detectives Brewer and Hendricks return to Utah, U.S. Marshals arrest Tom Egley for Loretta Jones' murder.
He was arraigned, and Tom says he would confess to the murder if he didn't have to confess to the rape. And of course, Heidi was more than happy to take that. Tom Egley got 10 to life for murdering Loretta Jones, but 10 to life was the maximum penalty that could be given to him in 1970.
He will be 96 years old when he goes out before the parole board, and I will make sure he doesn't get out.
Tom stood up and the judge asked him if he had anything to say. And the only thing he had to say is, I'm sorry I killed her, and I'm surprised you're doing something about it after 46 years.
And, you know, our family's sitting there in the courtroom like, really? What do you mean after 46 years? It doesn't matter if it was 46 minutes, 46 days, 46 years. The fact of the matter is you killed our sister, and you not only took life away from her, but you took it away from her little girl at 4 years old. You took it away from me enjoying her as a sister. You took it away from her mother and father to enjoy her in their last years. And for somebody like that not to show any remorse, it was...
On the night of June 5th, 1996, the Routier family house in Rowlett, Texas, appeared to be an ordinary suburban home. Inside were parents Darlie and Darren Routier and their 3 young sons. Nothing suggested that before sunrise, the quiet house would become the center of one of the most controversial murder cases in Texas history. Darlie Routier was a young mother living with her family in a comfortable neighborhood in Dallas County. Her husband, Darren, was asleep upstairs with their youngest son, Drake. Darlie was downstairs with Devin, 6, and Damon, 5. The 2 boys were sleeping in the family room, close to their mother. In the early morning hours of June 6, something happened that would permanently divide public opinion. According to Darlie's account, she woke and discovered that an unknown man had entered the house. She said the intruder attacked her and then turned on her children. Within minutes, Devin and Damon had suffered devastating stab wounds. Darlie herself was injured. She later told investigators that she fought with the attacker and tried to protect her sons. She said the man eventually ran from the house, leaving behind a scene that would take years to understand. A frantic emergency call brought police, paramedics, and firefighters to the Routier home. The first responders encountered a mother who had survived, 2 critically wounded children, and a house filled with evidence that seemed to point toward a violent attack. But the outcome for the boys was already beyond saving. Devin and Damon died from their injuries. Their deaths transformed a family tragedy into a major criminal investigation almost immediately. At first, the central question appeared straightforward: who had entered the home? Police needed to identify the stranger described by Darlie, determine how he had gained access, and establish where he had gone after the attack. Officers examined the property and surrounding area, searching for evidence of an escape route and clues that might lead them to a suspect. Yet the investigation soon became more complicated. There was no obvious intruder waiting to be found. No suspect emerged who matched Darlie's description. Instead, investigators began examining the physical evidence inside and outside the house with increasing suspicion. Every detail mattered. The position of objects, the blood patterns, the wounds, the condition of the home, and the location potential evidence were all scrutinized. One of the most unusual discoveries was a blood-stained sock found outside the house. To some, the sock appeared to support Darlie's account. If an intruder had fled after attacking the family, perhaps the sock had been carried outside during the escape. But investigators questioned how it had reached that location and what it truly proved. That single piece of evidence would eventually become part of a much larger argument over whether the crime scene represented a genuine home invasion or something deliberately constructed to look like one. As investigators continued, their attention gradually shifted toward Darlie herself. The woman who had initially been treated as a surviving victim was now being examined as a possible suspect. Her injuries were studied. Her statements were compared with the physical evidence. The sequence of events she described was tested against what investigators believed the crime scene showed. The shift was dramatic. Only hours earlier, the story had been about a mysterious attacker entering a family home in the darkness. Now, detectives were considering a far more disturbing possibility: that the person responsible for the deaths might never have entered from outside at all. For Darlie, This change meant that the investigation was no longer simply about finding the man she said had attacked her family. It was becoming an examination of her own behavior, her words, and her movements during the most terrible night of her life. The public knew only fragments of what investigators were discovering. News coverage quickly turned the deaths of 2 young boys into a national story. People wanted answers, and they wanted them quickly. But the more attention the case received, the more difficult it became to separate established facts from assumptions about what a grieving mother should look like, how a victim should behave, and what a crime scene should mean. That distinction would become crucial. The case against Darlie would eventually rest not on one single piece of evidence, but on a collection of circumstances that prosecutors argued were inconsistent with her story. Her defenders, however, would argue that those same circumstances could be interpreted differently. The result was a case built around competing narratives. In one narrative, a stranger entered the Routier home, attacked a mother and her children, killed 2 innocent boys, and escaped into the darkness. In the other, the apparent intruder was a fiction, and the crime scene had been manipulated to conceal what really happened. At this early stage, neither interpretation had yet been proven in court, but the direction of the investigation was already changing. Behind the police tape, investigators were trying to reconstruct minutes that could never be repeated. Every blood stain, every injury, every object, and every statement had to be placed into a sequence. Somewhere within that sequence, they believed, was the truth. The deaths of Devin and Damon had created an unanswered question that would follow Darlie Routier for decades. Was she a mother who survived an unimaginable attack? Or was she responsible for the deaths of the 2 children she claimed to be protecting? By sunrise on June 6, 1996, the answer was still unknown. The house was silent, the boys were gone, and the investigation had only begun. What happened next would transform a local tragedy into one of Texas's most fiercely disputed murder cases. And as detectives returned again and again to the same rooms, the meaning of the evidence seemed to change. A detail that first appeared insignificant could become most central overnight. The smallest inconsistency could challenge an entire account. In this case, the search for truth would soon become a battle over which story the evidence actually supported. As the first hours of the investigation passed, the Routier house became less a home than a puzzle. Detectives had to reconstruct a few violent minutes from blood, wounds, objects, and statements. Every detail mattered because the central question was becoming increasingly difficult to answer. Darlie Routier remained a key witness. She told investigators that she had been attacked by a stranger and that she had fought for her life. Her account described a sudden assault in the darkness, followed by the attack on Devin and Damon. She said the intruder eventually fled, leaving her injured and her children dying. But investigators did not have the luxury of accepting the story at face value. They had to test it against the physical evidence. The house was examined repeatedly, and detectives began documenting the precise locations of blood, furniture, clothing, broken items, and other objects. They wanted to know whether the scene looked like the aftermath of a struggle with an armed stranger. One of the earliest concerns involved the alleged point of entry. If someone had entered the home from outside, investigators needed to determine how that person had gained access. They also needed to identify a believable path through the house and a believable route away from it. The absence of a clear suspect made those questions more important. The blood evidence became another major focus. Blood was present in several areas, and investigators tried to understand how it had been deposited. Bloodstains can sometimes help establish movement, direction, and sequence, but interpretation depends heavily on context. In the Routier case, the evidence became part of a broader argument rather than a simple answer. The condition of the crime scene also raised questions. Investigators considered whether objects had been disturbed naturally during an attack or whether some had been moved afterward. They examined the relationship between the physical evidence and Darlie's description of events. With every comparison, the possibility of an intruder was being tested. Then there was the sock. The blood-stained sock discovered outside the home immediately attracted attention because it seemed to connect the interior violence with an escape route. If an unknown attacker had run from the house, a bloodied item outside could make sense. But detectives wanted to know exactly how it had gotten there. Its position, condition, and relationship to the rest of the evidence became increasingly important. For Darlie's supporters, The sock remained one of the details that could support the possibility of an intruder. For prosecutors, it could eventually be interpreted as evidence that the scene had been manipulated to create the appearance of an outside attacker. The same object could therefore be used to tell two completely different stories. The investigation also turned toward Darlie's injuries. She had clearly been hurt, but the important question was how those wounds had been inflicted. Detectives considered whether they were consistent with her description of a violent struggle. The prosecution would later argue that the nature and placement of some injuries did not fit the account she had given. That interpretation was disputed. Darlie's defenders argued that investigators were reading the evidence through a theory that had already begun to take shape. Once detectives suspected that the intruder's story might be false, they could naturally view ambiguous details as confirmation of that suspicion. This is one of the most difficult aspects of the case. Evidence does not exist in isolation. Investigators interpret it within a theory of what happened. If the theory changes, the meaning assigned to the same evidence can change with it. The police investigation therefore became a contest between competing reconstructions of the same night. In the first reconstruction, an unknown man entered the home, attacked Darlie, stabbed the two boys, and escaped. The violence was sudden and chaotic. The sock was connected to that escape. Darlie's injuries were the result of her attempt to survive. The lack of an identified suspect was frustrating, but not necessarily proof that the story was false. In the second reconstruction, there was no outside attacker. The violence happened within the family home, and the evidence suggesting an intruder was deliberately created. Under this theory, the sock and other unusual details were not traces of an escape, but elements of a stage scene. The difference between those theories was enormous. One presented Darlie as a surviving victim. The other placed her at the center of the crime. As detectives continued examining the house, they also considered the timeline. Timing was crucial. Darlie had to explain when she woke, when the attack began, when she discovered the boys, when the alleged intruder escaped, and when help was summoned. Investigators compared her account with what Darren remembered and with the physical evidence. Darren was upstairs when the attack occurred. His recollection could help establish the sequence, although the crucial moments had happened before he understood what was taking place. The tragedy was surrounded by uncertainty. Devin and Damon could never describe what they had seen. Darlie maintained that an intruder was responsible. Detectives were increasingly unconvinced. The public began forming opinions long before the courtroom would hear the complete case. As the investigation moved forward, Darlie's status changed in the eyes of law enforcement. She was no longer simply a witness. She was a person whose story had to be challenged, verified, and compared against every piece of evidence. That transition would shape everything that followed. The case was no longer simply about finding a missing attacker. It was about determining whether an attacker had ever existed. And before long, the question would move from the crime scene to courtroom, where prosecutors and defense attorneys would offer two sharply different explanations for the deaths of Devin and Damon. But first, investigators had to make one decision that would define the entire case. Whether the unusual details of the Routier home were signs of a terrifying intrusion, or signs that someone inside the house had created a terrifying illusion. The investigation changed direction when detectives began looking beyond the obvious story of a stranger fleeing into the night. The Routier house was no longer being treated simply as the scene of an unexplained home invasion. It was becoming a place where every detail had to answer a difficult question. Did the physical evidence support Darlie Routier's account, or did it contradict her? Darlie continued to maintain that an intruder had entered the house. She described a terrifying attack and said she had tried to protect Devin and Damon. Her injuries were real, and her two sons were dead. Yet investigators believed that the circumstances surrounding those injuries deserved closer examination. They studied where she had been wounded, how the wounds appeared, and whether they could have been produced during the struggle she described. The prosecution would later argue that some of Darlie's injuries were superficial and did not fit the picture of a prolonged fight with an armed stranger. Her defenders disagreed, emphasizing that a person attacked unexpectedly in darkness could move, struggle, and react in unpredictable ways. Then investigators examined the scene itself more closely. Furniture could move during a struggle. Blood could be transferred from one surface to another. Objects could be dropped, carried, or displaced. Investigators had to determine which movements were natural consequences of violence and which might indicate something deliberate. One of the most important issues involved the alleged point of entry. Darley had described an intruder entering the home, but investigators questioned whether the available evidence demonstrated that someone had actually broken in. If a stranger had entered, there should have been a plausible route into the house and an equally plausible route back outside. Police searched for possible suspects, but no stranger was arrested for the killings. There was no clear individual who could be placed inside the home through independent evidence. As days passed, the investigation began to focus more heavily on people who were known to have been in the house. That brought Darley directly into the center of suspicion. For detectives, the problem was not simply that her story lacked an identified attacker. They believed that parts of the physical scene were difficult to reconcile with the account she had provided. The prosecution would eventually claim that the apparent signs of an intruder were manufactured, creating the impression that someone had entered, attacked the family, and escaped. The blood-stained sock became especially important in this theory. Found outside the house, it seemed at first to offer a possible clue to an escaping attacker, but investigators questioned why it was there and whether its location made sense if a stranger had actually fled. If the sock had been deliberately placed outside, prosecutors could argue that it was intended to create an escape trail. That interpretation was strongly disputed. A piece of evidence can be suspicious without proving who placed it there. The sock could raise questions, but questions are not automatically answers. The physical evidence also had to be considered alongside the family's circumstances. Darren Routier was in the home that night, but he was upstairs with the youngest child. Darley and the two older boys were downstairs. This meant that investigators had to reconstruct the timeline from statements and physical evidence rather than from someone who had witnessed the entire event. As the investigation continued, the deaths of Devin and Damon remained the emotional center of everything. They were young children who had been sleeping when the violence began. Their deaths made the case especially difficult for investigators and for the public. People naturally wanted a simple explanation, but the evidence did not immediately provide one. Darley's behavior also became a subject of intense scrutiny. Investigators and later prosecutors examined her words, reactions, and conduct after the attack. They searched for inconsistencies that might reveal whether she was telling the truth. But behavior is complicated. Fear, shock, grief, confusion, and exhaustion can produce reactions that look unusual to outsiders. The case nevertheless moved steadily toward prosecution. The investigators' theory was becoming clearer. They believed the crime had not been committed by a mysterious stranger. They believed the scene contained evidence intended to make police think that an intruder had been responsible. Under that theory, Darley's injuries, the blood evidence, the sock, and the alleged entry and escape route all had to be understood as parts of one deliberate deception. Darley's position remained completely different. She insisted that she had not killed her children. She maintained that the attack was real and that the person responsible had escaped. To her, the investigation was moving in the wrong direction because detectives had become convinced that she was guilty before every alternative possibility had been exhausted. This conflict between the two narratives would soon become impossible to avoid. The state was preparing to present a case in which the physical evidence was interpreted as evidence of staging. The defense would argue that the same evidence could support an entirely different conclusion. Between those two positions stood a family shattered by violence and two children who could never tell anyone what they had seen. The case was moving toward trial, but the most important battle had already begun. It was a battle over interpretation, and once the evidence entered a courtroom, 12 jurors would have to decide which story they believed. The coming trial would force jurors to examine not only what happened, but what the evidence truly meant. By the time the case reached the courtroom, the question was no longer simply who had killed Devin and Damon Routier. The prosecution had developed a theory that challenged almost every important part of Darley Routier's account. According to the state, the evidence did not describe a random home invasion. Instead, it pointed to a crime committed inside the house and followed by an attempt to make investigators believe an unknown attacker had been responsible. Darley pleaded not guilty. She continued to insist that she had not killed her sons and that an intruder had entered the home that night. For her defense, the central issue was not whether the scene looked unusual. It was whether the unusual details proved beyond a reasonable doubt that Darley had committed the murders. The prosecution presented the crime scene as a carefully constructed sequence. Prosecutors focused on a lack of a convincing outside suspect, the physical evidence, the injuries suffered by Darlie, and the circumstances surrounding the alleged escape. Their argument was that the story of an intruder could not withstand close examination. One of the most powerful parts of the prosecution's presentation involved the children's deaths. Devin and Damon had suffered multiple stab wounds, and the violence against them became the emotional center of the trial. Prosecutors argued that the attack was not the unpredictable result of a stranger suddenly entering a family home. They portrayed it as an act committed by someone who was already inside and knew the children were there. The defense offered a different interpretation. Darlie's attorneys challenged the state's conclusions and argued that the evidence could not establish the prosecution's reconstruction with certainty. They emphasized that an actual violent attack could create a chaotic scene, and they questioned whether investigators had interpreted ambiguous evidence through the assumption that Darlie was guilty. The question of Darlie's own injuries became particularly important. She had suffered a serious wound to her neck, along with other injuries. The prosecution argued that the injuries were not consistent with the kind of struggle Darlie described. They suggested that the wounds had been inflicted in a manner that could support a staged crime scene. The defense rejected that interpretation. A person attacked with a knife might react unpredictably, they argued, and the appearance of injuries could not automatically reveal the exact sequence of events. What investigators considered suspicious could also be understood as the result of a frightening and chaotic encounter. The distinction was critical because the prosecution did not have an eyewitness who could tell the jury that Darlie had killed her sons. The state's case, therefore, depended heavily on circumstantial evidence. Jurors were being asked to look at numerous details and determine whether those details formed a coherent explanation of the crime. Circumstantial evidence can be powerful when many independent facts point in the same direction, but in the Routier case, the defense argued that the individual pieces were being connected according to a theory that was itself disputed. The blood-stained sock became one of the most memorable pieces of evidence discussed during the proceedings. Prosecutors viewed its location as part of the supposed staging of the scene. They argued that it helped create the appearance that an attacker had left the house. The defense questioned that conclusion. If an intruder had really fled, the sock could have been connected to the escape. The fact that investigators found it suspicious did not necessarily establish who had placed it there or why. This became the central problem of the trial. The jury was not merely asked to identify physical facts. It had to decide what those facts meant. The prosecution also placed attention on Darlie's behavior following the deaths of her children. One piece of evidence that received enormous public attention was a videotape recorded during a gathering at the family's gravesite. Darlie appeared emotional, but also smiled and behaved in a way that some viewers considered inappropriate for a mother mourning two murdered children. The prosecution used the footage to suggest that Darlie's behavior revealed something about her emotional state and credibility. The image became extremely powerful in the public imagination because it was easy to understand emotionally, even if interpreting someone's grief from a brief recording is inherently difficult. The defense argued that grief does not follow a single script. People can laugh, smile, speak, or behave strangely while experiencing profound trauma. A moment captured on videotape, they argued, could not prove that Darlie was responsible for murder. Yet the footage had an effect that went beyond technical evidence. It influenced the way many people viewed Darlie as a person. Once the public began asking whether she looked like a grieving mother, the case moved beyond forensic evidence and into judgments about human behavior. That distinction would remain controversial long after the trial ended. The prosecution continued assembling its theory. Darlie had been present when the children were killed. No intruder had been identified. Certain aspects of the scene appeared inconsistent with her account. Her injuries were presented as suspicious. The sock was interpreted as evidence of staging. Her behavior afterward was presented as further evidence that her story could not be trusted. Taken together, prosecutors argued the circumstances pointed toward guilt. The defense attempted to separate those circumstances and show that each one had another possible explanation. The absence of an identified intruder did not prove that no intruder existed. Suspicious injuries did not automatically establish that Darlie had inflicted them herself. An unusual object outside the house did not prove that it had been planted, and an unconventional emotional response did not prove murderous intent. But a criminal trial does not require every individual piece of evidence to prove guilt by itself. The question for the jury was whether the entire body of evidence established guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. As testimony continued, the tragedy inside the Routier home was transformed into a battle between two competing narratives. The prosecution's narrative was stark. Darlie had killed her sons and then attempted to create a false explanation. The apparent intruder was a fabrication. The unusual evidence at the scene was not random. It was part of a deliberate effort to mislead investigators. The defense's narrative was equally stark. Darlie had survived a real attack. She had been injured while trying to defend herself and her children. Investigators had become convinced that she was responsible and had interpreted uncertain evidence accordingly. The failure to find the attacker did not mean the attacker never existed. For the jury, the decision was not about which story sounded more dramatic. It was about whether the evidence established one story as true beyond a reasonable doubt. The courtroom also had to confront a painful reality. 2 young boys were dead, and whoever killed them had never been identified in a way that could be independently tested through a trial. The state therefore had to convince jurors that the surviving mother was responsible. The pressure surrounding the case was immense. Outside the courtroom, public opinion was already divided. Some people saw Darlie as a cold and manipulative mother. Others believed she had become the target of an investigation that failed to adequately pursue the possibility of an unknown attacker. Inside the courtroom, however, the jury had to focus on evidence presented according to the rules of trial. Eventually, after hearing the prosecution and defense, the jurors reached their decision. Darlie Routier was found guilty of murdering her son Damon. The verdict carried the most severe punishment available under Texas law at the time. She was sentenced to death. For many observers, the verdict appeared to confirm the prosecution's theory. Darlie had been convicted, and the state had successfully persuaded the jury that the intruder story was false. But the verdict did not end the argument. Instead, it began a new chapter. Darlie continued to maintain her innocence. Her supporters continued to challenge the interpretation of the evidence. Questions remained about the crime scene, the sock, the investigation, the forensic conclusions, and the way Darlie's behavior had been used to judge her credibility. For those convinced of her guilt, these questions did not erase the larger pattern of evidence. For those convinced of her innocence, the unanswered questions were precisely why the conviction remained troubling. The trial had produced a legal conclusion, but not universal agreement about what happened that night. And that distinction would become increasingly important as the years passed. Darlie Routier was now on death row, while the names of Devin and Damon remained permanently connected to a case that had divided Texas and attracted attention far beyond the state. The courtroom had chosen one interpretation of the evidence, but another interpretation continued to survive. The next battle would not take place before the original jury. It would unfold through appeals, reviews, challenges of evidence, and continuing public debate. The conviction had answered the legal question for the moment. It had not silenced the question that had haunted the case from the beginning. What if the crime scene had been interpreted incorrectly? And what if the story of the intruder, rejected by the jury, contained more truth than anyone had been willing to believe? The guilty verdict did not bring an end to the Darlie Routier case. Instead, it opened a second chapter in which the evidence, the investigation, and the meaning of the original trial will be examined again and again. Darlie remained on death row, continuing to insist that she had not killed her sons. Outside the prison, supporters continued asking whether the evidence had truly established what happened inside the Routier home. For those who believed the conviction was correct, the answer seemed straightforward. The prosecution had presented a pattern of circumstances that pointed toward Darlie. No intruder had been identified. Investigators had found details they believed were inconsistent with her account. The state argued that the crime scene had been manipulated and that the apparent escape route was part of a false story. The jury had heard those arguments and found her guilty. But for those who questioned the conviction, the same evidence remained troubling. Their concerns focused on the possibility that investigators had become committed to one theory too early. Once Darlie became the primary suspect, evidence that appeared suspicious could be interpreted as confirmation of guilt rather than as a question requiring further investigation. The possibility of an outside attacker they argued, deserved more attention than it received. The blood-stained sock remained one of the most frequently discussed details. Its discovery outside the house seemed unusual, but unusual did not automatically mean fabricated. If the sock was genuinely connected to an intruder, its location could be explained as part of an escape. If it had been deliberately placed there, however, it could support the prosecution's theory of staging. The difficulty was that the sock could not speak for itself. It could show where it was found and contain physical evidence, but determining why it was there required interpretation. That interpretation became one of the central disagreements surrounding the case. Other physical evidence created similar disputes. The condition of the house, the alleged entry point, the blood evidence, and Darley's wounds were all examined through competing theories. Supporters of the conviction believed the collection of evidence formed a coherent pattern. Critics argued that several details had alternative explanations, and that the existence of alternative explanations should have created reasonable doubt. The distinction between possibility and proof became increasingly important. A criminal conviction does not require investigators to explain every imaginable scenario, but the defense did not need to prove that Darley's version was true. It needed to raise sufficient doubt about the prosecution's version. That distinction became the foundation for later arguments over case. Darley's behavior also remained controversial. The graveside video had already influenced public perceptions during the trial, but years later it continued to appear in discussions about her guilt. Some viewers saw her behavior as disturbing and difficult to reconcile with genuine grief. Others believed it was unfair to use a brief recording as a window into someone's emotions after the deaths of 2 children. Human grief can be unpredictable. Some people become silent. Some cry constantly. Others may laugh unexpectedly or behave in ways that appear detached. None of those reactions alone can establish whether a person committed murder. Yet, in a highly publicized criminal case, emotional impressions can become powerful. Once the image of Darley smiling at the gravesite entered public consciousness, it became difficult for many people to separate that image from the evidence. The case also raised broader questions about how jurors evaluate mothers accused of harming their children. Society carries powerful expectations about how a mother should behave. A mother who loses a child is expected to look devastated in recognizable ways. When a grieving parent does not conform to those expectations, people may interpret the difference as evidence of guilt, but behavior is not a forensic test. The appeals process therefore became an important avenue for challenging conviction. Darley's attorneys continue to argue that errors and weaknesses in the original case needed further examination. The legal system, however, requires appeals to meet specific standards, and disagreement with a verdict is not enough by itself to overturn a conviction. Over the years, different legal challenges focus attention on evidence and procedure. Some arguments were rejected, while others resulted in additional consideration of particular issues. Yet the fundamental conviction remained. Darley's supporters did not disappear. They continued to argue that the case had never adequately explained every significant detail. They questioned whether the investigation had sufficiently pursued the possibility of another person being responsible. They also questioned the certainty with which prosecutors described the crime scene as staged. Those who believed Darley was guilty responded that the unanswered questions did not erase the evidence that had convinced a jury. They pointed to the absence of a credible intruder, the prosecution's reconstruction of the scene, and the circumstances surrounding Darley's injuries. To them, the defense alternative remained speculative, while the evidence against Darley formed a consistent pattern. This disagreement explains why the case has survived in public memory for so long. Many murder cases eventually become historical records. The names of victims remain, the legal outcome is established, and public attention fades. The Root-Ure case developed differently because the evidence itself became the battlefield. The argument was not simply about whether Darley was guilty. It was about how evidence should be interpreted and how much uncertainty is acceptable before conviction becomes unsafe. That question became especially important as forensic science developed and standards changed. Evidence that appeared persuasive in the 1990s could later be viewed differently when new methods, new testing techniques, or new understandings of crime scene analysis became available. The Root-Ure case therefore became part of a larger discussion about wrongful convictions, forensic evidence, crime scene interpretation, and the limits of circumstantial proof. At the same time, the victims could not be forgotten beneath the controversy. Devin and Damon were not merely pieces of evidence in a courtroom argument. They were brothers, children with families, personalities, routines, and futures that disappeared in a single night. Their deaths were the reason the investigation existed in the first place. Every legal argument about Darley's guilt ultimately returned to the question of how those two boys died. That emotional reality made the debate even more difficult. For Darley, maintaining her innocence became a lifelong struggle. For the families and people who believed the conviction, the guilty verdict represented accountability for two children who could no longer speak. For critics of the case, the verdict represented the possibility that an innocent woman had been condemned because investigators misunderstood a complicated crime scene. Both sides saw themselves as seeking justice, and both sides believed the evidence supported them. Years after the original trial, the central competing narratives remained almost unchanged. One story said Darley had murdered her sons and created a false intruder scenario. The other said an unknown attacker had entered the home, killed Devin and Damon, wounded Darley, and escaped. The lack of universal agreement did not mean that the legal system had no answer. It did. Darley had been convicted and sentenced to death. But legal finality and factual certainty are not always perceived as the same thing. That difference is what keeps the case alive. People continue returning to the crime scene, examining photographs, discussing the blood evidence, reconsidering the sock, analyzing the injuries, and debating Darley's behavior. Every generation seems to approach the case with the same question. Was the original interpretation correct? Perhaps the most disturbing feature of the case is that the same evidence can produce such opposite conclusions. A sock outside a house can look like the trace of an escaping killer or the planted clue of a staged crime. An injury can look like evidence of an attack or evidence of deception. A strange emotional reaction can appear suspicious or simply human. A missing suspect can mean an investigation failed to find the truth, or it can reinforce a belief that no such suspect ever existed. The evidence does not change. The interpretation does. And that is why Darley Routier remains one of the most debated murder defendants in Texas history. The final chapter of the story is not simply about whether one woman was guilty or innocent. It is about how a courtroom transforms uncertainty into a verdict, how public opinion transforms evidence into a narrative, and how difficult it can be to revisit conclusions once they have become established. For Devin and Damon, there is no appeal, no retrial, and no opportunity to explain what happened. For Darley, there has been no end to the fight over the meaning of that night. The house in Rowlett became a crime scene in 1996. The courtroom became the place where one interpretation prevailed. But outside the courtroom, another interpretation continued to survive. And decades later, the question remains hauntingly simple. Did investigators uncover a carefully concealed murder inside a family home, or did they mistake the surviving victim for the person responsible? The answer depends on how the evidence is read. And that is precisely why the Darley Routier case refuses to disappear. Years passed, but the conviction did not settle the questions surrounding the Routier case. Darley remained on death row, and the argument over what happened inside the Rowlett house continued far beyond the original trial. For some people, the verdict represented justice for Devin and Damon. For others, it represented a conviction built on evidence that could be interpreted in more than one way. The legal process continued through appeals and challenges. Darley's attorneys continued to contest aspects of the prosecution's case, while the state maintained that the original conviction was supported by the evidence presented to the jury. The courts did not simply reopen the entire case whenever questions were raised. Each appeal had to meet specific legal requirements, and that made the path toward overturning the conviction extremely difficult. Outside the courtroom, however, the debate operated under different rules. Researchers, journalists, supporters, critics, and members of the public could return to the evidence and ask questions without being limited to the arguments accepted at trial. They examined the crime scene, the blood evidence, the sock, Darley's injuries, and the timeline. They also revisited the way investigators had interpreted the alleged intruder. The more people studied the case, the clearer one fact became. Almost every major piece of evidence had become part of a larger argument about interpretation. Consider the alleged intruder. The prosecution argued that the absence of a credible suspect was significant because an attacker who entered the house, killed 2 children, injured their mother, and escaped should have left some independent trail. No such person was identified. The defense did not necessarily need to identify the attacker. However, its argument could remain that the state had not conclusively proved that no attacker existed. That difference is fundamental in criminal law. The burden of proving guilt belongs to the prosecution. A defendant does not normally have to solve a crime in order to establish reasonable doubt. For critics of the root year conviction, this principle remains central. They argued that the investigation should be judged not only by what it found, but also by what it failed to establish. If an intruder was impossible, they asked, what evidence made that impossible? If the crime scene was staged, what evidence proved that staging rather than merely suggesting it? For supporters of conviction, the answers were found in the total pattern. They believed the absence of an identified attacker was only one part of the case. Combined with the crime scene, Darley's injuries, her statements, and the state's theory of staging, they believed the evidence pointed overwhelmingly toward guilt. The argument therefore became less about individual facts and more about whether those facts formed a convincing whole. The sock remained a symbol of that dispute. It was physically real, but its meaning depended on reconstruction. If it belonged to an escaping intruder, it could be an accidental trace left behind during flight. If it had been placed there intentionally, it could represent an attempt to manufacture evidence. The object itself could not tell investigators which explanation was correct. The same problem applied to the blood evidence. Blood can reveal important information about movement and contact, but its interpretation depends on many factors. In a violent scene involving several injured people, blood can be transferred, disturbed, and deposited in complicated ways. Investigators must reconstruct those movements carefully. The prosecution presented its interpretation as part of a coherent explanation. The defense argued that the evidence was more ambiguous than prosecutors suggested. This disagreement did not disappear after the trial. Instead, it became one of the reasons the case remained so fascinating and controversial. Another enduring issue was the treatment of Darley's behavior. The graveside video became one of the most recognizable images associated with the case. To those who believed she was guilty, the footage appeared deeply disturbing. To those who defended her, it demonstrated how easily grief could be judged through expectations about how a bereaved mother should behave. There is no universal expression of grief. A person can experience overwhelming pain while appearing calm for a moment. Someone can laugh because of nervousness, exhaustion, memories, or social pressure without feeling happiness about a death. Emotional behavior can be meaningful, but it is difficult to treat it as direct proof of a murder. That does not mean behavior should never be considered in an investigation. It means that behavior becomes dangerous evidence when it is separated from context. The Root Year case illustrates that problem clearly. Once investigators suspected Darley, ordinary actions could acquire new meanings. A statement might appear inconsistent. A reaction might seem suspicious. A physical detail might be interpreted as deliberate. The theory of the crime could begin influencing the interpretation of the evidence, while the evidence simultaneously reinforced the theory. This creates a difficult investigative problem known as confirmation bias. When investigators develop a strong belief about what happened, they may unconsciously give greater weight to evidence supporting that belief and less weight to evidence that challenges it. Avoiding that problem requires investigators to actively test alternative explanations. There is also a human dimension that should never be lost. Devin was 6 years old. Damon was 5. Whatever interpretation one accepts, 2 young children died violently inside their own home. Their deaths cannot be reduced to an argument about forensic evidence. The legal debate may focus on Darley, but the original tragedy was about the boys. Their photographs, memories, and names became part of a public story that continued for decades. Yet, public fascination can sometimes obscure the lives of victims. The more controversial the defendant becomes, the easier it is for the victims to disappear behind the debate. For those who believe Darley was guilty, remembering Devin and Damon meant insisting that their deaths required accountability. For those who believe she was innocent, remembering the boys meant demanding that the true killer, if someone else was responsible, should never be allowed to remain unidentified. Both positions claimed to seek justice for the children. Meanwhile, Darlie continued living under the consequences of the conviction. A death sentence creates a unique kind of uncertainty. The person condemned may spend years waiting while appeals and legal proceedings continue. The original crime becomes separated from daily life, yet the central accusation remains unchanged. The case also became part of a broader national conversation about wrongful convictions and the reliability of forensic evidence. Advances in DNA technology and changing standards for forensic analysis caused many older criminal cases to receive renewed attention. People began asking whether evidence presented with confidence decades earlier will be interpreted the same way today. In the Routier case, that distinction is especially important. A new test might answer a specific forensic question, but it might not answer the larger question of what happened during those critical minutes in the house. That is why the case continues to attract attention. It contains nearly every element that makes a criminal investigation difficult. A violent crime inside a private home, young victims, a surviving parent, an alleged unknown attacker, disputed physical evidence, emotional behavior, circumstantial proof, and a conviction followed by years of controversy. The story also demonstrates how quickly a victim can become a suspect. In the first hours after the attack, Darlie was a surviving mother whose children had been murdered. As investigators became suspicious, the focus changed. Her injuries were no longer viewed only as evidence of victimization. Her statements were no longer simply testimony. Her behavior was examined for signs of deception. Once that transformation occurred, the case developed a momentum of its own. The original theory of an intruder became increasingly difficult to defend in the eyes of investigators. The theory of staging became increasingly persuasive to prosecutors, and eventually it became persuasive enough for a jury to convict. Yet a verdict cannot erase every unanswered question. Today, the Routier case remains a reminder that a crime scene can become a battleground between competing narratives. One side sees a mother surviving an attack. The other sees a mother concealing responsibility for her children's deaths. Both sides can point to the same physical evidence and draw different conclusions. That is what makes the case so unsettling. The central mystery is not whether Darlie Routier was guilty. It is whether the evidence used to establish her guilt was interpreted correctly. If the prosecution's reconstruction was accurate, then the deaths of Devin and Damon were followed by an elaborate attempt to mislead investigators, and the conviction represented the identification of the person responsible. If the defense's interpretation was closer to the truth, then the investigation may have focused on the wrong person, while the real attacker disappeared. Between those possibilities lies the enduring uncertainty of the case. The legal system reached a verdict. Darlie Routier was convicted and sentenced to death. But public debate continued because legal certainty does not always produce universal factual certainty. For decades, people have returned to the house the evidence and the same unanswered questions. And perhaps that is the haunting part of the story. The night of June 6, 1996, lasted only a short time. Its consequences have lasted a lifetime. Nearly 3 decades after the deaths of Devin and Damon Routier, the central question surrounding their final night remained deeply contested. The legal system reached a verdict long ago. Darlie Routier was convicted and sentenced to death for Damon's murder, and she has continued to maintain that she did not kill either of her sons. Yet the controversy surrounding the case has never disappeared because the arguments that divided the courtroom continue to divide the public. The story begins with facts that no one disputes. On June 6, 1996, 2 young brothers died violently inside their family home in Rowlett, Texas. Devin was 6 years old. Damon was 5. Their mother, Darlie, was also injured. She told authorities that an unknown man had entered the house, attacked the family, and escaped. What happened next became the foundation of everything that followed. Investigators searched for evidence of an intruder, but no definitive outside suspect emerged. As they examined the house, their attention shifted toward the possibility that the scene had been staged. The prosecution eventually argued that Darlie had killed her sons and then attempted to create the appearance of a home invasion. That theory convinced the jury. But a conviction is not the same thing as universal agreement about the truth. In the years that followed, questions about the evidence continued to attract attention. Supporters of Darlie argued that the investigation had not sufficiently established what happened to the alleged intruder. They questioned the interpretation of the physical evidence and argued that the prosecution's reconstruction depended too heavily on assumptions. Those who believed in convictions saw the situation differently. They argued that the absence of a credible attacker was significant, especially when combined with the other circumstances of the case. To them, the crime scene contained too many inconsistencies with Darley's account to accept the intruder theory. At the heart of the disagreement is a simple but difficult principle. Evidence can be interpreted within a narrative, but the narrative can also influence how the evidence is interpreted. If investigators begin with the belief that a stranger entered the house, a blood-stained object outside may appear to be evidence of escape. If investigators begin with the belief that the crime was staged, the same object may appear to be evidence of deception. The physical object has not changed. Only the explanation has changed. This problem extends beyond the root year case. Crime scenes are rarely perfect. People move through them. Objects are displaced. Blood is transferred. Memories become confused. And events happen quickly. Investigators must reconstruct the past from traces left behind in the present. The challenge is especially difficult when the person who could provide the most important account is also the person accused of the crime. Darley's story has remained consistent on its most important point. She says an intruder attacked the family. She has denied responsibility for the deaths of Devin and Damon. Her supporters therefore believe the case should continue to be examined through the possibility that someone outside the family was responsible. Her critics believe the opposite. They see the intruder story as an attempt to explain away evidence pointing toward Darley. They believe the jury correctly recognized a pattern, and that the conviction remains justified. The dispute has also been shaped by public perceptions of Darley herself. The videotape from a graveside gathering became one of the most controversial images associated with the case. Some viewers interpreted her behavior as evidence that she was emotionally detached from the deaths of her sons. Others saw the same footage as a poor basis for judging grief. The danger of relying heavily on emotional impressions is that they can become substitutes for evidence. A person who behaves differently from what society expects may appear suspicious, but unusual behavior does not establish who committed a crime. Nevertheless, public perception can influence how a case is remembered. Once an accused person becomes associated with a particular image, every later discussion can be filtered through that image. Darley became, for many people, either a grieving mother who had survived an unimaginable attack or a mother who had murdered her children and attempted to deceive investigators. There was little room for a middle ground. The same division exists when discussing the crime scene. Supporters of the conviction point to what they see as inconsistencies that collectively undermine the intruder account. Critics point to the same evidence and argue that investigators interpreted uncertain details too confidently. The blood evidence remains part of that debate. The sock remains part of that debate. Darley's injuries remain part of that debate. The alleged entry and escape remain part of that debate. Even her behavior remains part of that debate. Almost every major element has become a symbol of one side or the other. Yet beneath all of this controversy are two children whose lives ended before they could grow up. Devin and Damon were brothers. They had parents, a younger sibling, routines, personalities, and futures that were suddenly erased. Their names became permanently attached to a criminal case, but they were more than victims in a courtroom. They were children whose absence transformed an entire family. That fact should remain at the center of any discussion about the case. The legal controversy cannot bring them back. A new interpretation of the evidence cannot change what happened to them. The only thing that can change is our understanding of how and why they died. That is why unresolved questions matter. If the conviction is correct, then understanding the evidence more clearly reinforces a conclusion that the boys were killed by someone inside the home and that the apparent intruder was part of deception. If the conviction is wrong, then the unanswered questions become far more serious. They would mean that the real circumstances of the murders were misunderstood and that the person responsible may never have been held accountable. Those possibilities carry enormous consequences. For the legal system, the case demonstrates the importance of careful investigation, reliable forensic analysis, and protection against confirmation bias. For the public, it demonstrates how easily a complex crime can be reduced to a simple story. For families of victims, it demonstrates the terrible pain of knowing that a verdict may never completely answer every question. The passage of time does not necessarily resolve uncertainty. Sometimes it makes uncertainty harder to confront because memories fade, evidence becomes less accessible, and original assumptions become embedded in the history of a case. But time can also create opportunities for reconsideration. New forensic technologies, improved analytical methods, and renewed scrutiny can sometimes change how older evidence is understood. That possibility is one reason the Root Year case continues to attract attention. The case has become more than the story of one defendant. It is a case study in how criminal investigations are constructed, how circumstantial evidence works, and how public opinion can become intertwined with legal proceedings. It also forces a difficult question about certainty. How certain must we be before we conclude that one interpretation of a crime scene is correct? In court, the standard is high. Guilt must be established beyond a reasonable doubt. But outside courtrooms, people often make judgments with far less information. They see a headline, a photograph, a video clip, or a single piece of evidence and form an immediate opinion. The Root Year case demonstrates why that can be dangerous. A photograph cannot show everything that happened. A sock cannot explain why it was there. A wound cannot always reveal an entire sequence of events. A person's expression cannot reveal everything happening inside their mind. And an unanswered question is not automatically proof of innocence or guilt. The truth, if it could be reconstructed perfectly, would exist independently of what anyone believes. But human beings do not experience the past directly. They reconstruct it from evidence. That is the enduring mystery of the Root Year case. 2 children died inside a Texas home during the early morning hours of June 6, 1996. Their mother survived. She gave investigators one explanation. Prosecutors eventually presented another. A jury chose the prosecution's version and returned a guilty verdict. The legal record, therefore, has an answer, but history has continued to ask questions. Was the investigation right to abandon the intruder theory? Were the physical clues interpreted correctly? Did the crime scene truly demonstrate staging? Were Darley's injuries evidence of an attack or something else? Did the blood-stained sock reveal an escape route or an attempt to create one? And did the emotional behavior used against Darley actually tell investigators anything reliable about her guilt? These questions have survived because the case contains a tension that cannot easily be resolved. The evidence appears compelling to one side and incomplete to the other. That is what makes the story so haunting. The Root Year house became a crime scene for only a short period of time, but the interpretation of that scene has continued for decades. The verdict closed one legal chapter, yet it did not close the public debate. Darley Root Year remains convicted. Devin and Damon remain dead. Their family remains marked forever by what happened that night. And somewhere between the certainty of the verdict and the uncertainty that still surrounds the evidence lies the question that has followed this case from beginning. What truly happened in the Root Year home before dawn? Only one version of that night can be the complete truth. The tragedy is that the 2 children who knew the answer were never able to tell anyone. Why does the Darley Root Year case remain so controversial? What makes the Darley Root Year case so controversial is not simply the brutality of the crime, but the fact that the same evidence has been interpreted through 2 completely different narratives. To the prosecution, the evidence pointed toward a mother who had killed her 2 sons and then attempted to make the deaths look like the work of an unknown intruder. To Root Year and those who continue to support her claims of innocence, the evidence leaves open the possibility that an outside attacker entered the house, committed the killings, injured her, and escaped before police could identify him. The disagreement involves almost every important part case, from physical evidence to Root Year's behavior and the reconstruction of the crime scene. One of the central issues is the absence of a clearly identified intruder. No stranger was arrested and prosecuted for the killings. That absence became extremely important to the prosecution because an unidentified attacker had to explain how someone could enter a house, attack 3 people, leave behind evidence, and disappear without being caught. Prosecutors argued that the lack of a convincing suspect was consistent with the theory that there had never been an intruder at all. In their view, the supposed break-in was part of an attempt to create an alternative explanation for what had happened inside the home. Supporters of Routier see that conclusion differently. The fact that police did not identify an intruder does not, by itself, prove that no intruder existed. An unidentified offender can remain unidentified, particularly when the crime happens at night and the available evidence is incomplete or difficult to interpret. For those who question the conviction, the important issue is therefore not simply whether police found another suspect, but whether the physical evidence conclusively eliminates the possibility of one. The crime scene itself is another major source of disagreement. Investigators identified details that they believed were inconsistent with a genuine home invasion. They questioned the condition and location of certain objects, the apparent movements of the attacker, and the relationship between the physical evidence and Routier's account. These details help prosecutors construct the theory that the scene had been staged. But staging is an interpretation, and that distinction is crucial. A piece of evidence can appear suspicious without necessarily proving who created it or why it was there. The more complicated the reconstruction becomes, the greater the possibility that different investigators can reach different conclusions from the same physical facts. Critics of the prosecution's theory argue that some of the evidence was treated as proof of staging, when it could also have been consistent with a chaotic and violent attack. The blood evidence has also contributed to the continuing debate. Blood patterns can provide important information about movement, position, and the sequence of events, but interpreting blood evidence requires assumptions about how the injuries occurred and how people moved afterward. In a case as emotionally charged as this one, those interpretations can become central to competing narratives. Prosecutors use the blood evidence to support their reconstruction of the crime, while people who doubt the conviction have questioned whether every pattern can be explained with the certainty presented at trial. The injuries suffered by Routier are similarly disputed. She was wounded during the incident, and prosecutors argued that some characteristics of her injuries were difficult to reconcile with her description of an attack by a stranger. They suggested that the wounds were not consistent with an attempt by an unknown killer to murder everyone in the room. This became part of the argument that Routier had deliberately injured herself or otherwise participated in creating the appearance of an attack. Her defenders have challenged that interpretation. They argue that the existence of injuries on Routier does not establish how those injuries were inflicted, and that the circumstances of a violent confrontation can make wounds difficult to reconstruct with certainty. The disagreement, therefore, goes beyond the injuries themselves. It concerns what those injuries can legitimately prove. Another famous piece of evidence is the bloody sock discovered outside the house. The sock has remained one of the most discussed details because its location appears, at first glance, to support the possibility that an attacker left the home. If an unknown person had fled from the residence, leaving an item behind could make sense. Yet investigators question how and why the sock came to be where it was, and the prosecution argued that it could have been deliberately placed to reinforce the story of an intruder. For people who believe Routier was wrongfully convicted, the sock represents something very different. They see it as evidence that deserves a fuller explanation rather than as a simple component of a stage scene. Its significance has lasted because it sits directly at the boundary between the two competing theories. If it was genuinely carried or dropped by an escaping attacker, it supports the intruder scenario. If it was deliberately positioned to mislead investigators, it supports the prosecution's theory. Routier's behavior after the killings also became part of the controversy. At the memorial service for her sons, she was recorded smiling and behaving in ways that some viewers considered disturbing or inappropriate. The footage attracted enormous public attention and helped create a negative image of her. Prosecutors used the video as part of the broader picture they presented to the jury. Yet emotional behavior is difficult to use as reliable proof of guilt. People respond to grief, shock, trauma, and public attention in very different ways. A behavior that looks strange to one observer may have little connection to criminal responsibility. Critics argue that the memorial footage influenced public opinion far more strongly than it could logically establish what happened during the killings. Media coverage amplified this problem. Routier was not simply a defendant in a criminal courtroom. She became a highly recognizable figure in a case involving the deaths of 2 young children. The public naturally wanted an explanation, and the image of a mother accused of killing her own sons was especially shocking. Once a particular narrative became familiar, later evidence could easily be interpreted through that narrative. Those who believed she was guilty saw suspicious behavior as another piece of the puzzle. Those who believed she was innocent saw the same attention as an example of how public perception can shape the interpretation of ambiguous evidence. The legal history of the case also contributes to the controversy. Routier was convicted in 1997 of murdering her son Damon and received a death sentence. She has continued to maintain that she was attacked by an intruder and has pursued legal challenges to her conviction. Continuing litigation has kept the case in legal discussion. Ultimately, the controversy survives because the two sides begin with fundamentally different assumptions about what happened that night. If the intruder theory is true, then the unexplained elements of the crime scene may represent the remnants of a chaotic attack that investigators failed to reconstruct correctly. If the prosecution's theory is true, those same irregularities become signs of deliberate staging. The meaning of the evidence changes depending on which narrative comes first. That distinction remains central to continuing debate today. That is why the Darlie Routier case continues to attract attention. It is not merely a question of whether one person is innocent or guilty. It is a case about how investigators construct a story from incomplete physical evidence, how prosecutors turn that story into a theory of motive and action, and how jurors decide whether the theory has been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. It also demonstrates how difficult it can be to separate objective evidence from interpretation once a powerful narrative has taken hold. There is no surviving account from Devin or Damon that can resolve the central mystery. The only surviving adult participant has consistently offered one version of events, while the prosecution presented another. The conviction established the legal conclusion reached by the jury, but the continuing debate reflects the fact that many people remain unconvinced by the interpretation of the evidence. For that reason, the question surrounding the Routier home remains one of the most enduring mysteries of the case. Were investigators looking at the traces of a carefully constructed deception, or were they looking at the confusing aftermath of a real and devastating attack by someone who was never identified? 9. A mother, a victim, or a killer. The question at the heart of the Darlie Routier case is also the simplest and most difficult one. Was Darlie Routier a mother who survived an unimaginable attack, or was she responsible for the deaths of her own children? The courts reach a legal conclusion, but outside the courtroom, disagreement continues because the central evidence can be placed into two very different stories. For the prosecution, the story was direct. Darlie was inside the house when Devin and Damon were killed. She survived the attack with injuries of her own. No intruder was identified. Investigators believed important parts of the scene were inconsistent with an authentic home invasion, and they argued that the physical evidence made more sense if the scene had been staged. From that perspective, the apparent mystery was not evidence of an unknown killer escaping justice. It was evidence of an attempt to make investigators believe an unknown killer existed. The prosecution also relied on the circumstances surrounding the crime rather than on one single piece of evidence. The location of the wounds, the condition of the house, the movement of blood, the broken window, and the bloody sock were considered together. Prosecutors argued that these details formed a coherent pattern. In their reconstruction, the violence inside the home was followed by an effort to create a false narrative about an intruder. The fact that Darlie was a surviving adult in the room became particularly important because there were few alternative explanations available to investigators. Yet the opposing interpretation begins with a different premise. Darlie has consistently maintained that a stranger entered the house and attacked the family. Supporters of her innocence argue that the absence of an identified suspect should not be confused with proof that no suspect existed. A person can commit a crime without ever being identified. They also argue that a violent nighttime attack could produce confusing evidence, unusual blood patterns, displaced objects, and injuries that are difficult to reconstruct years later. The bloody sock remains especially important because it appears to connect the interior crime scene with the outside world. If the sock was carried or dropped by an escaping attacker, it could support the existence of an intruder. If it was deliberately placed, as prosecutors suggested, it could support the theory of staging. The significance of the sock, therefore, depends on a larger reconstruction of the crime. By itself, it does not automatically answer the question of who was responsible. The same problem exists with the physical injuries suffered by Darlie. Prosecutors argued that her wounds were inconsistent with the kind of attack she described. Her defenders have argued that injuries sustained during a sudden and violent confrontation cannot necessarily be reconstructed with absolute certainty. The question is not whether she was injured, because she clearly was, but what those injuries reveal about the sequence of events. Different assumptions about the attacker, the weapon, the positions of the people involved, and the timing of the violence can produce different interpretations. Another source of controversy is the way Darlie's personality and behavior were presented to the public. The memorial video became particularly influential. Viewers saw Darlie smiling and behaving in a manner that many considered inappropriate while remembering her children. For some people, the footage seemed to confirm suspicions that something was deeply wrong. But behavior during extreme grief is not a simple measure of guilt. People can laugh, smile, become emotionally numb, speak strangely, or behave unpredictably while experiencing shock. What appears suspicious to an outside observer may have no direct relationship to the truth of a criminal allegation. This distinction between evidence and interpretation is essential to understanding why the case remains so divisive. Evidence does not always arrive with its meaning attached. A broken window is a physical fact. Whether it was created by an intruder, created by someone inside the house, or interpreted incorrectly is a separate question. A bloody object outside a residence is a physical fact. Whether it was dropped during an escape or positioned deliberately is an inference. A person's unusual behavior is observable. Whether that behavior demonstrates guilt is another inference entirely. The legal system had to choose between competing explanations. In 1997, Darlie was convicted of murdering Damon Routier and sentenced to death. That verdict became the official legal determination of responsibility for Damon's death, and debate continued for years afterward. For Darlie's supporters, the continued uncertainty is itself significant. They believe the investigation focused too heavily on her once detectives became suspicious of the intruder story. In their view, evidence that might have supported an outside attacker deserved more attention, while evidence interpreted as incriminating was sometimes treated with too much confidence. They argue that once investigators developed a theory that Darlie was responsible, later observations were increasingly understood through that framework. Those who accept the conviction see the same history differently. They argue that investigators were confronted with an extraordinarily serious crime scene and had to determine which explanation best fit the available evidence. From their perspective, the intruder theory required too many unanswered questions, while the staging theory explained the unusual features of the scene more effectively. The absence of a credible identified attacker, combined with the prosecution's reconstruction of the physical evidence, was enough for the jury to reach its verdict. There is also an important difference between saying that a case is controversial and saying that a defendant has been proven innocent. Controversy means that reasonable people continue to dispute the interpretation of evidence or the fairness of the process. It does not automatically overturn a conviction. Likewise, a conviction does not mean that every individual question surrounding a case has been permanently answered. The legal conclusion and the historical debate can exist at the same time. That distinction matters especially in cases that receive years of documentaries, television coverage, interviews, and online discussion. Each new retelling can emphasize different facts. One version may focus on the bloody sock. Another may focus on the wounds. Another may focus on the broken window or the memorial video. When isolated details are removed from their original context, they can appear more decisive than they actually are. A responsible examination therefore requires looking at the evidence as a whole rather than treating one dramatic detail as the key to everything. The tragedy at the center of the case should also remain separate from the debate about Darlie's guilt. Devin and Damon were real children whose lives ended violently inside their family home. Whatever interpretation a person accepts, their deaths are not merely pieces of a legal puzzle. The continuing fascination with the case can sometimes turn the children into symbols of an argument about forensic science, wrongful convictions, or criminal investigation. But before any theory comes a reality that 2 young lives were lost. Ultimately, the question of what happened in the Routier home remains inseparable from the limits of reconstruction. Investigators arrived after the violence had already occurred. They did not witness the attack. They had to work backward from injuries, blood, objects, statements, and other traces. Prosecutors then transformed those observations into a narrative of guilt. Darlie offered a competing narrative of survival. The jury chose one of those narratives, but the passage of time has allowed others to continue questioning it. The most unsettling aspect of the case is therefore not simply that one side believes Darlie is guilty, while another believes she is innocent. It is that both sides can look at the same house, the same night, and many of the same physical details and construct entirely different explanations. One explanation requires a mother to have murdered her children and staged an attack. The other requires an unknown person to have entered a family home, committed a brutal crime, wounded Darlie, and escaped without being identified. Those possibilities cannot both describe what happened. Somewhere between them lies the truth of that night. The enduring question is whether the evidence has already revealed that truth, or whether important parts of the story remain hidden inside the uncertainty surrounding the crime scene. For that reason, the Darlie Routier case continues to provoke debate decades after the murders. It is a reminder that in a criminal investigation, finding evidence is only the beginning. The harder task is deciding what that evidence actually means. 10. What really happened inside the Routier home? More than 3 decades of discussion have not produced a universally accepted answer to the central question of the Routier case. On the night of June 6, 1996, 2 young brothers were killed inside their family home in Rowlett, Texas. Their mother survived with injuries and told investigators that an unknown man had entered the house. Police ultimately rejected that account. Prosecutors argued that the crime scene had been staged, and a jury convicted Darlie Routier of murdering her son Damon. Yet the case has continued to divide the public, because the evidence has never produced the same conclusion for everyone who examines it. The legal system answered the question of responsibility when Routier was convicted. That verdict remains a fundamental part of the history of the case. But a legal verdict and a complete reconstruction of every second of crime are not necessarily the same thing. A jury must decide whether the prosecution has established guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Historians, investigators, journalists, and members of the public often ask a different question. Can we now reconstruct exactly what happened, without assumptions, unanswered details, or competing interpretations? That distinction helps explain why the Routier case remains so compelling. There is no simple piece of evidence that can be separated from the larger story and treated as an instant solution. The bloody sock, the broken window, the wounds, the blood evidence, the statements, and the behavior of the people involved all became parts of a larger reconstruction. Each detail acquired meaning because of the theory surrounding it. Once investigators believed that the scene had been staged, unusual details could be interpreted as signs of staging. If someone begins with the possibility of an intruder, those same details can instead be interpreted as traces left by a violent and unpredictable attack. The unknown intruder theory has obvious difficulties. No perpetrator was identified, and no stranger was brought to trial for the killings. A successful reconstruction of an outside attack must therefore explain how an unknown person entered the home, attacked the children, injured Darlie, and escaped without being identified. It must also explain the physical evidence that investigators believe did not fit that scenario. These questions were powerful reasons for the prosecution to argue that the intruder story was invented. At the same time, rejecting an intruder theory requires more than pointing out that police never found one. The absence of an identified suspect is not physical proof that an unknown offender could not have existed. Criminal investigations sometimes end without identifying the person responsible. The real question is whether the evidence inside and outside the home makes an outside attacker implausible, or whether investigators simply could not establish that possibility strongly enough to identify one. The prosecution's theory also has its own difficult questions. If Darlie was responsible for the killings and then attempted to create the appearance of a home invasion, investigators had to explain the sequence of actions that produced the crime scene. They had to determine how the injuries were inflicted, how the blood was distributed, why particular objects were where they were, and how the apparent evidence of an intruder was created. The staging theory can connect many suspicious details, but connecting details into a narrative is different from observing the act itself. The case also demonstrates how quickly public opinion can become part of a criminal investigation. The image of a mother accused of killing her children is emotionally overwhelming. When people see footage of Routier behaving in a way they consider unusual after the deaths, they may form an opinion before studying the forensic evidence. Once that opinion exists, later information can be filtered through it. A person who already believes she is guilty may see every unexplained detail as suspicious. A person who believes she is innocent may see every suspicious detail as an example of investigative tunnel vision. Neither reaction is a substitute for careful analysis. For those who believe a conviction was correct, the overall pattern is difficult to dismiss. They see a crime scene that did not behave like a straightforward home invasion, injuries that raise questions, an intruder who was never identified, and conduct that prosecutors believe supported their theory. Taken together, those facts persuaded the jury that the prosecution's explanation was more convincing than the alternative. For those who believe Routier was wrongfully convicted, the same pattern looks different. They see an investigation that moved toward the mother after detectives became skeptical of her account, physical evidence whose interpretation was contested, an outside attacker who was never conclusively ruled out in the minds of her supporters. They question whether suspicion gradually became certainty before every alternative explanation had been exhausted. The difference between these positions is not simply emotional. It reflects two different standards for interpreting uncertainty. One side asks which explanation best fits the available evidence. The other asks whether the evidence eliminates reasonable alternative explanations strongly enough to justify a conviction. Those questions overlap, but they are not identical. A theory can appear highly persuasive without answering every question that observers may raise. That uncertainty is precisely what makes the case so enduring. The longer the debate continues, the more important it becomes to distinguish what was directly observed from what investigators inferred, and what the jury decided from what observers believe. The Routier case therefore sits at an uncomfortable intersection between law and uncertainty. The law requires a decision. A jury cannot leave a criminal trial permanently suspended between two theories. It must evaluate the evidence presented and reach a verdict. History is different. History can continue asking questions after the verdict. It can examine evidence, reconsider assumptions, identify weaknesses in earlier reasoning, and acknowledge uncertainty without having to produce a new verdict. That does not mean every doubt about the case proves innocence, nor does the existence of conviction mean that every question has disappeared. Both statements can be true at once. Routier remains convicted of Damon's murder, while people can still debate the interpretation of evidence surrounding the crime. The distinction is important because sensational cases often become distorted when legal conclusions, personal beliefs, and factual observations are treated as if they were exactly the same thing. Perhaps the most disturbing possibility is that the final answer may never satisfy everyone. If Routier was guilty, then 2 children were killed by someone who was supposed to be part of their family, and the subsequent scene was designed to hide the truth. If she was innocent, then an unknown attacker committed a devastating crime and disappeared, leaving behind evidence that investigators interpreted in a way that ultimately led to the wrong person being convicted. Both possibilities are deeply troubling, but only one can describe what happened. The enduring mystery is therefore not whether the case has an official answer. It does. The deeper mystery is whether the official answer represents the complete truth of that night. That is a question that continues to draw people back to the Routier home decades after the crime. Perhaps that is why the case remains so difficult to forget. It contains everything that makes a criminal investigation frightening. A family home that should have been safe, children attacked while they slept, a surviving parent with an extraordinary story, physical evidence that can be interpreted in competing ways, and a legal system forced to choose between those interpretations. In the end, the most honest conclusion is not to pretend that every disputed detail has a universally accepted meaning. The honest conclusion is that Darlie Routier was convicted, that she has continued to deny responsibility, and that the circumstances surrounding the killings remain the subject of intense public debate. The verdict provides the legal conclusion. The unanswered questions explain the controversy. And so the final question remains the same one that has followed this case for decades. When investigators entered the Routier home after the violence was over, were they looking at the aftermath of a carefully staged murder or the traces of a real attack by someone who escaped into the darkness? The answer determines not only how Darlie Routier should be remembered, but also how we understand the deaths of Devin and Damon, the investigation that followed, and the limits of certainty in a case where the truth can no longer speak for itself. 11, the questions that remain. Decades after the deaths of Devin and Damon Routier, the case remains difficult to discuss without returning to the same unresolved question. What happened during the few minutes when the family home became a crime scene? The courts reached a verdict, but the public conversation never reached the same level of certainty. For some people, the evidence forms a convincing picture of a mother who killed her children and then attempted to make the crime appear to be an attack by an unknown stranger. For others, the investigation left too many questions unanswered to make that conclusion comfortable. Controversy does not automatically mean that a conviction was wrong in itself. A controversial case can still have a legally valid verdict. At the same time, a verdict does not require every detail of an investigation to be beyond debate. The jury considered the evidence presented at trial and reached its decision. Years later, people examining the case can still disagree about the reliability, meaning, and weight of particular pieces of evidence. That distinction is especially important in the Routier case because the central dispute concerns interpretation. The physical evidence did not arrive with a written explanation attached to it. Investigators had to reconstruct events from what remained after the violence. They had to decide how people moved through the house, how injuries were inflicted, how blood reached different surfaces, and how objects came to rest where they were found. Those decisions created a narrative, and the narrative influenced how other evidence was understood. The possibility of an intruder presents one version of that narrative. In this account, a stranger entered the home during the night, attacked the sleeping children, confronted Darlie, injured her, and eventually escaped. The bloody sock outside the house can be understood as part of that escape. Damage to the home can be interpreted as evidence of entry or departure. The confusion at the scene can be explained by the suddenness and violence of the attack. The fact that no suspect was ultimately identified becomes an unanswered question rather than proof that the attack never happened. The prosecution's theory presents a fundamentally different narrative. In that version, there was no unknown attacker. The violence was committed within the family, and the apparent signs of a break-in were created afterward to redirect investigators. Details that seem strange under the intruder theory become understandable under the staging theory. The lack of a stranger becomes significant. The injuries to Darlie become significant. The placement of evidence outside the house becomes significant. When these details are viewed together, prosecutors argued they point toward one explanation. The difficulty is that a reconstruction can become persuasive precisely because its individual pieces appear to support one another. Once investigators accept one theory, every new observation is evaluated against it. A detail that fits the theory strengthens it, while a detail that does not fit may be explained as an exception, an unusual circumstance, or evidence that was misunderstood. This is not unique to the Routier investigation. It is a risk present in many complex criminal cases. The case also shows why public perception can become so powerful. People do not approach a story involving the deaths of two children as neutral observers. The emotional reaction is immediate. When the surviving parent is accused, the question becomes even more disturbing. Many people instinctively search for behavior that confirms their feelings about the defendant. A person who appears calm may be judged cold. A person who cries may be judged sincere. A person who smiles at the wrong moment may be judged deceptive. None of those reactions can replace physical evidence, but they can influence how physical evidence is remembered. Darlie's behavior after the killings became part of that larger public image. The memorial footage was especially damaging because viewers could interpret her expressions without knowing what she was experiencing internally. Grief is not always visible in a consistent or recognizable form. Shock, exhaustion, disbelief, nervousness, and emotional instability can produce behavior that looks strange from the outside. Yet, once the footage became associated with the accusation against her, it became difficult to separate the image of Darlie from the question of guilt. There is also a human cost that can become obscured by decades of argument. Devin and Damon were not simply evidence. They were brothers, sons, and children with lives that ended before either could explain what happened. Their deaths are the reason the investigation began, the reason the trial occurred, and the reason the case still matters. The continuing debate should not reduce them to symbols in an argument about forensic science or wrongful convictions. The case also raises broader questions about how certainty is created. In a criminal trial, certainty does not mean knowing every fact with perfect precision. It means reaching the level of proof required by the law. Outside the courtroom, however, people often expect something different. They want a complete story in which every object, injury, statement, and movement has one indisputable explanation. Real investigations do not always provide that kind of certainty. This is why the root year case continues to generate disagreement. One person can examine the evidence and conclude that the prosecution's theory explains the scene most convincingly. Another can examine the same evidence and conclude that important alternatives were not eliminated. Both may believe they are following the facts. The disagreement can arise not because one side ignores evidence, but because the sides assign different levels of confidence to the same interpretations. Over time, new discussions about the case have often returned to the same questions. Was the crime scene genuinely consistent with an intruder? Were the injuries compatible with Darley's account? What does the bloody sock actually prove? Could the physical evidence distinguish between staging and chaos? Did investigators fully consider every alternative before focusing on Darley? Or did the accumulating evidence reasonably lead them toward the conclusion that she was responsible? There may never be a single piece of information capable of resolving all of these questions. That does not mean investigation is pointless. It means careful examination must distinguish established facts from conclusions built upon those facts. The legal history remains clear. Darley Routier was convicted of murdering Damon and sentenced to death. She has continued to maintain that she did not kill her children and that an intruder was responsible. The conviction remains the official legal conclusion. The continuing debate concerns whether that conclusion represents the complete truth of what happened in the Routier home. Perhaps the deepest lesson of the case is that a crime scene can preserve traces of an event without preserving its meaning. Blood can remain on a surface, an object can remain outside a house, a wound can remain on a body, and a broken window can remain in a wall. But none of those things can explain themselves. Investigators must give them context. Prosecutors must turn that context into an argument. Defense attorneys challenge that argument. Jurors decide whether the evidence meets the required standard. Later generations then revisit the entire process and ask whether the original interpretation still appears convincing. In the end, the question is not simply whether people believe Darley or believe the prosecution. The more important question is whether the evidence can support only one possible reconstruction of that night. If it can, then the mystery is largely one of history. If it cannot, then the disagreement will continue, because the central event can still be imagined in two fundamentally different ways. The house is no longer the active crime scene it once was. The investigation is decades old. The trial belongs to another era, and the people who stood inside that courtroom have moved through years of consequences. Yet the essential question remains frozen in time. 2 children died. Their mother survived. An explanation was offered, challenged, tested in court, and accepted by a jury. But outside the courtroom, the debate continues. That may be the most lasting legacy of the Darley Routier case. It reminds us that justice depends not only on finding evidence, but on understanding what evidence can and cannot prove. It reminds us that a compelling story is not necessarily the same as an unquestionable fact. And above all, it reminds us that when a crime leaves behind conflicting traces, the search for truth can continue long after a verdict has been delivered.